So that's what we're here to talk about, is this concept of error proofing, and what is it, and what is Lean's approach to the mindset of error proofing? What's the philosophy and the background, and how could we potentially use it to overcome that all too human error in our processes, services, and products? So just briefly, for those who maybe haven't come across us before, Training Leadership Consulting, we're a Pietermaritzburg-based organization, so we work very closely with the Maritzburg and Midlands Chamber of Business, but also work around the country and beyond, through our purpose being to inspire a generation of proactive problem-solving leaders. So we're all about helping leaders become more effective in what they do, in leading their teams and in solving the problems that they have, whether those are problems in their teams, in their companies, for their customers, etc. Because if people are skilled with being able to solve problems, this is going to help our economy, and it's going to help us to succeed as a country, society, etc. as well. So this is how we see our purpose. And of course, a lot of what we do is either consulting or training in the broader business improvement field, which includes the Lean Six Sigma suite of methodologies, body of knowledge, etc., as well as all related elements, change management, leadership development, and general skills development as well, through a few very specific learnership programs, which we can leverage and align to our business improvement process. Right, so that's maybe just a little bit about us. Let's talk error proofing. We're going to touch on what it is, of course. Let's always try and give it a definition. Let's understand, and this is where it'll be great to hear some comments from others around where are the typical areas where you've seen, where you think perhaps error proofing could be helpful. We'll then get into some of the sort of technical details around what is it, how does it work, and so on. We'll explore some typical examples, because that's what we say here, steal with pride, or steal with your eyes, learn from what others are doing, and adopt that where it works for you, and improve of it, of course, and then in turn share back with others, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion. The intent is we should finish well before 6, so that it gives everybody time. Obviously, those who want to stay on a bit and chat in the discussion are very welcome to. And those who need to duck off can do as well. We're obviously available. You can give us a call tomorrow, or an email or something like that if there are any follow-up comments and questions. Okay. What is this thing of error proofing? I think it's fairly self-explanatory in its in the words of it. It's about implementing a range of mechanisms, tools, devices, processes, steps, whatever it might be, with the intention of eliminating errors and or defects, ultimately ensuring that we don't end up with defects, defective products or services or whatever it might be that reach our customers. And when we talk about customers, it's anybody who might be benefiting or using something that we provide at the end of the day. So the concept here is, what if and what about a situation where it's just not acceptable? Even a small mistake, a small defect is not acceptable, is going to be a problem, and we therefore have to make sure we design them out. So design out errors from the beginning. So it sounds simple in principle, right? So let's talk about some of many of these kinds of errors that can come up, that maybe these error proofing, or as the Japanese term Poka-Yoke, might help us address. And we'll talk a little bit about that Japanese term and where it comes from a little bit later as well. So first of all, there could be areas where we forget something, or we don't process, or we have a gap, or perhaps where we set up a job wrong, or maybe there's an error in the kind of tool we use or our measurement, maybe mixing things up, leaving things out in an assembly line, or maybe putting in the wrong one You know, for example, if you think of a car manufacturing line where you've got the assembly line going, the last thing you want is for them to leave out a key component when they're putting together your brakes or your transmission system or your whatever it might be, or putting the wrong one in, you know, the one for the Toyota Hilux instead of for the Camry, whatever it might be. And of course, potentially doing the wrong thing at the time, measuring and so on. And any of these elements are all very typical areas where we look at to say, well, is there something that could be done that might help prevent that? Now, where these things come from, the human errors, this is the, oh dear, oops, my mistake situation that can happen to all of us. And these are some of the types of altogether human errors that we need to be aware of, that perhaps might be areas where we need to bring in error proofing concepts. So we all have had the situation where we're not concentrating. Life is busy. We're juggling 100 balls. And who knows, maybe we're worrying about something else. We've got a sick family member, or there's something going on, got other worries. We're easily not concentrating in some way or another. We also tend as humans to jump to conclusions or make assumptions sometimes, which may not be the right ones. And of course, when you've got lots of different people, we might jump to different conclusions. So what I might think is obvious in one situation may not be obvious to someone else, and they may well see it very differently for whatever reason. Education, life experience, different ways of looking at things, any of those elements. So that's all very possible. We then also could have, you know, the different ways we look at things, or sensory errors. What I might feel that something's feeling hot, but you touch it and think, no, that's fine. What doesn't feel that hot today, for example, if we're using that as a judgment on whether or not something is ready to use and on temperature, that could easily lead to errors, certainly in different ways that things are performed. And of course, any of these other elements, we don't have enough training, or if it needs a lot of training for the job to be done right, or there might be when we're tired that we make mistakes or we get distracted, whether we, you know, don't get things done when we should, whether we perform to different standards. And my idea of what good enough is different from yours, you know, and we're not necessarily clear on how much is enough or good enough. And then adapting in some cases where things change. We may say we've got a set of rules for doing a particular thing, but then how do we help people to compensate when it's a different customer or a different product or a different situation? And then, of course, sometimes, and hopefully not often, we need to understand there might be almost deliberate errors, intentional errors. Either people just going, I don't see why this is a rule and why I have to do it that way, so I'm going to do it the quick, easy way, without realizing that actually there's a reason for that step or requirement in place. And of course, hopefully hardly ever, but in serious situations, understanding from a risk management point of view, if there is an area where sabotage could cause serious issues, what should we do to prevent that from happening? Anybody want to add anything, or do these errors talk to the kinds of problems or issues that you would encounter and that you're here today to try and engage and learn a little bit more about what could help with them? Any comments? Okay. I think Alison has a hand up, is that right?
Yeah, hello Tanya, and good evening, everyone. I haven't had the opportunity to be exposed to the lean process in manufacturing before, although my husband's an avid lean converted manufacturing manager. But I have to say that having been involved in incident management, whenever we look at root cause, I have to say that the list there is quite comprehensive. When looking at root cause, particularly when a human is involved. And it's very real. And the more transactions humans do, the more risk there is. So I think that list is great, and certainly a usable list as well.
Perfect, thank you. No, and wonderful, and I really like what you're calling out there as well, which is, you know, we often find folk in let me call it manufacturing or production kind of jobs. Lean is something that's often seeded strongly within them. But one of the areas where we're always trying to talk about it and make people aware is that often, in fact, there are even bigger opportunities in non-manufacturing environments for lean thinking to come in and eliminate. In manufacturing, people to some extent think this way because the consequence of errors when you've got safety issues, there's a risk of injury, for example, with moving machinery, and the consequences are more severe potentially. And so people go in and really put thought into preventing implications of this. But even in service environments or the back office, as it's often known, these sorts of things also, there are always opportunities to bring them in. Some of these errors can be just as consequential in service as they might be in manufacturing. So good that we bring these ideas to bear. Any other comments there? I'm looking for hands. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. The only one that sort of just comes to mind, but I think it is there right at the bottom, is the ability to take shortcuts in various tasks, whether it's a processing task or a manufacturing task. That often, that's just something that came to mind. I suppose it would be an ignore rule, but I think if sometimes you're finding that shortcuts almost become the norm, and that can be problematic.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, and I think it's one of these things people often don't understand why a rule and whether the rule is, walk this way on the line and stay within the lines, or if it's follow the process like this, etc. They might not understand why certain things are like that. And it just looks like this is unnecessary and I should take a shortcut here. And so these are definitely areas to look at to see, well, if it's critical, how do we make sure it's not possible to skip this step, for example, as the case might be. Okay. Here are some other things, and if you're finding any of these elements coming up, it could be a pointer that perhaps this is an area where perhaps we can bring in error proofing as a possible solution. So for example, if a job has to change often, which might mean it's not possible to have people fully skilled on it at all times, or you're needing to bring in additional people, let's say they're seasonal jobs, so you're bringing people for short periods and not the rest, those kinds of things, or they're having to learn and change frequently, so they don't ever get to a point of being highly skilled because it changes too often. Where the processes are really complex and difficult and not necessarily intuitive or straightforward to get right, where it's not possible to have standards, where we don't have time to do all the training that might be required, and people just need to come in and quickly get up to speed because there's just no time to train, or it's too expensive, or whatever the case might be, where it's difficult to put in a lot of measurement and checks and balances on the work to check and make sure no errors get through by inspection and so on. We're going to talk a bit more about inspection just now, where there are things like, I'll talk for myself. If there's a job I do every day, I've got, there's two different sides to it. If I'm doing it often, maybe I get a bit complacent. I take my eye off the ball and I make a mistake from that because it's repetitive or tedious to do. But the other side is when I have a job to do that I don't do very often, like, I don't know, maybe doing my taxes once a year or something like that, or entering something, doing an online transaction that I don't have to do very often. I'm often scratching my head as to what to do, even though I know a year ago I was able to do this and I figured it out. So there's an example where if you might have an infrequent task, even somebody who's been trained before on that task, to changing a setting on a machine, but it's something they don't do very often. It's only done on this rare occasion. So they've been trained, but now they're forgetting, etc. Those kinds of things. And of course, then we've got to understand sometimes are there issues potentially with attitude or motivation, depending on the particular job in question and the kind of employees or people who are in those kinds of roles. There could be reasons where motivation is a challenge. Now, obviously, We want our team members involved, motivated, engaged. So that shouldn't be an issue. And of course, we want them well trained and up to speed and fully competent and aligned. But in many cases, that alone may not be enough for all the real reasons that we have in our jobs. And a lot of people, when we have a problem like something going wrong at work, will just be, oh, we need to train those guys again, or I'm going to discipline them. They need attention. Those guys need better attention to detail. They really, et cetera, et cetera. And that's often, we're angry often in the moment when an error happens, particularly if that error reaches our customers and we're getting customer complaints, or there's been a safety issue or something like that. We immediately tend to jump into the training is bad, or they need retraining. And maybe I shouldn't say that, because we obviously like having lots of opportunities to run training. But the point being, training isn't always the solution to everything. It's not ideal in certain cases like these, where people aren't doing the job often, or it's tedious and repetitive and they get distracted. And to remember that actually we're all human. We all sometimes may, in the same situation, miss something, send out that email without realizing we'd made a mistake in it, or that report, or whatever it might be, and forget something, miss something, and so on, even in something we know that 99.5 times out of 100 we would do perfectly. So let's put this a little bit to the test. I want to see whether or not we can work as a group on some of these areas where there might be some of these typical problems that you might encounter. So those of you, some of you might have seen these before. Let's see, you can play along, or maybe you can help me in explaining some of them to others. So with this first one, I'm going to throw up a few words in a little diagram. Ideally, read the words aloud. If someone come off your mics, off your mutes, or type it into the chat or something like that. And let's see. So I'm going to put them up and let's read them and see. What does that say? Part of a very well-known phrase. Come on, Ian. Say that again.
A bird in the hand. Oh, okay.
What was that, Ian? What did you suddenly notice on reading it a second time?
I assumed.
Right. You see, what happens is, this is exactly, our brains see something that starts to look familiar. A bird in the hand is a well-known saying. And in fact, many people just go, yes, it's worth two in the bush, etc. And it's only when we go back and take another look, or when you read it again, that, oh gosh, there's a second the, and I missed it. And how often does something like that happen to us, right?
The assumption was that, okay, this is the first one. I can see, no, there's nothing wrong with this. And this is obviously your first one. It's just to ease us in. So no, I'm absolutely confident about this. Oh dear.
Okay. So even something simple like this, we won't spot the mistakes like this. And we see it often in these situations where you'll be reading something where your brain will see what you think is there because it looks familiar. And then you miss the different things. And that's even, I mean, others who've been even in, like teachers, read these things a lot. We'll miss something like this because it's something that our brains are expecting. And really, you see it in this sort of way where you understand that our brains make sense of patterns. And here, anybody who's an English teacher is probably squirming because we always were told that spelling really matters, and it does. But is there anybody here who's not able to make sense in reading this little paragraph? Anybody want to read it out loud? Or anybody can't? Anybody seen this one before?
Yeah, I haven't used it.
Exactly. So in this case, and in some ways, you'll say, well, it's clearly meant to be like that, or it's designed. And this is the point, though, is that this is how our brains work. We look for patterns. We don't necessarily look at every single thing. And of course, you'll see then you might find it's not difficult to potentially miss, for example, a spelling error or certain things just being out of order, even if the broader elements are in place. It's all too easy sometimes. Dion's saying, what? I'd offer to read it. Oh, I see. Being very smart for us there in looking at how these elements might play out in terms of the different ways of reading it. Okay, so this is an example. How about another one then? Never mind English. How about just something really simple, like a line? Have you seen this one? Some of you might remember it from your school days. You know, I only realized it had a fancy name much later in life, but it's this good old thing whereby you've got two lines. Here's one line, so from that point to that point, and here's the other. If we look in this block first, and this line from here to here, these two lines are exactly the same length. But because of these arrows that have been put on the ends, our brains, most of ours, and particularly, it's interesting if you go and read about this Müller-Lyer illusion, in certain cultures, people are not confused by it, but in other cultures, particularly those that are in, let me call it more westernized, urbanized kind of cultures, you know, our brains are used to looking, and these are often the basis of perspective and depth and 3D type elements with a lot of rectilinear angles around us. Our brains are drawn into seeing this line as longer. And then with this one, which was a newer one to me, the way you use this one is to say to somebody when they've got this, draw the midpoint of, this is the line from here to here, approximately where would you draw the midpoint? And most people, and to me anyway, even though I look at this thing often now, the midpoint is somewhere here, right? Actually, same thing, these two lines are the same length, and this little arrow in the middle is a decoy. So if, for example, you were in a job where you needed to cut a length in half based on your eyes, you would be nowhere near particularly accurate, as an example, if it had this particular little confusing element to it. All right, so let's do maybe another one. Who's feeling awake? We're going to, and I'll give you maybe a minute or so, perhaps I'll time it. Count the number of times the 6th letter of the alphabet. So imagine this is an error or a problem or something like that, and you're inspecting a piece of work for this. So I'll give everybody about a minute to read through the text on the next slide, and then I'd like to find from everybody what your answer was. How many times does the 6th letter of the alphabet appear in the text on the following slide? Any questions about the instructions? Ian looks ready. All right, here's the words. Okay, give you a minute to count how many of the 6th letter there are. Okay, 30 seconds. $15 seconds. No pressure, hey? $5 seconds. Okay. So let's see who is feeling bold or brave enough to share what you had. We've got a 30, we've got a 29. Just trying to see in the chat. 37. I mean, we've all got quite different numbers. 30, 29, 37. Which are the other ones I'm missing? Let me just see if I can grab into the chat and see who else has put. Okay, 26. There we go. Anybody feel that was an easy job, especially under time pressure? Okay, you're all wanting to know what the answer is, right? Now, in theory, this is easy. We've all been reading for many years. Can't see the last word, the word management. Is that part of the challenge? Okay, all right, we've got a 35. I think Dion's counted again. He got 37 the first time and 35 the second time, right? Okay. Hasn't changed. How do we do this? I'll give you the answer now. I'll put you all out of your misery. The answer is 36. Did anybody actually get 36? It's not easy. It's really difficult. Even something like this, where we've all been reading for many years and we know exactly what an F looks like, and we've can read this many times, we will come with different answers. And what will happen is now we'll go, ooh, who's right? I don't know. Dion would be lucky because he'd say, let's average it. And he'd have 35 and 37 and his average would be 36. So by average, he'd come there. But if we mix everybody in here, some of us are guessing. We've got 29s, 37s, 30, 26. It's really difficult. So this is the situation we have, is even people who are trained to read in this case are going to make mistakes and have different numbers, even in something as simple as this. So Ian, maybe I won't put any more tests to you or to anyone else. Hopefully, you know, we've made the point that even those of us who are skilled, capable, educated, knowledgeable, and could do in a simple inspection are likely to make errors, even at the best of times, and not be perfectly accurate. And then many examples. I've been doing some work with a company in the Eastern Cape, and they produce consumer goods that you and I can potentially buy in a supermarket. And on each pack, there's a printed, you know, the Videojet inked date, the production date, date of manufacture, etc., or packaging date, as the case might be. And they were saying to me they had to have the situation where at the changeover of the year from 2021 to 2022, the machinery, the settings, etc., have to be updated. 3 people checked and signed off the change from 2021 to 2022. And then they discovered, I think it came back from the trade, that what was on the cartons or the cases was 20221. Oops. Okay, 3 very capable, highly educated, technical people looked at this and didn't. So here's a perfect example of how inspection is not, you know, because that's what a lot of people, let's just put an extra layer of authorization. Let's just get one more person to check it. Let's just get, but the next person will say, well, I got 32 Fs. So is my answer better than yours? Don't know. And this is where error proofing comes in. So it comes from the Japanese phrase, this concept of Poka-Yoke, or it comes from Poka-Yokeru, and it was developed by Shigeo Shingo, who worked for Toyota as a method of achieving 0 defects. And obviously it starts from a manufacturing space, but clearly, as we could see, there could be potentially many other areas that would be useful, because in many of these manufacturing elements, there's a lot of repetitive work, you know, taking a component, inserting it, taking a component, inserting it, that kind of stuff. And the idea being that if we make it easy to do right and impossible to do wrong, people don't have to be so stressed and worried that they might make silly mistakes. They can relax, they can potentially engage their brains on other work as well. And so he was a leading expert, and among other things, he developed this particular tool, as well as a single-minute exchange of dies, which is critical for quick changeovers of machinery, so that you change from one product to another really quickly. And he's recognized today in the world of lean through the Shingo Prize. That's awarded to top lean organizations. This is what he realized, was that there's the difference between the inevitable fact that humans will make mistakes and what we need to do to make sure that those mistakes don't go through to our customers. But without stepping in and inspecting at every step of the way. So the aim of Poka-Yoke or error proofing is to design the process in a way that mistakes are either detected or corrected immediately, or it's just not even possible to do it the wrong way. And straight away you can see there could be more than one way to do this. So let's start with this as our strategy, a mindset of let's spot the error, let's inspect for it and check the goods or services before they go out. But as we've seen with counting the F's, we miss the filler words like of, or our minds are drawn in a particular way, or we make assumptions, we're going to miss things. The next one is some sort of a test that will help detect the error as it's made, when it's made, for example. And here an example might be if you need to tighten on a setting or something to a certain degree of torque. You set a torque gun with a setting where it'll have go green or red as an example, and we'll have some more of these examples. Or it's something where it's just not, you prevent, I try and put this in, but it won't go in the wrong way. I realize I've got to turn it and put it in the other way. Or finally, and this is the obviously gold standard in error proofing, it's just not possible for this to happen. Only one way to do it and no other way is even possible. There is a process you can follow, but maybe let's not spend too much time on it. It's obviously a mindset of saying, let's understand what can go wrong, where it can go wrong, analyze these tasks to see what are the typical mistakes that actually are all too human and normal and to be expected, not lazy, lack of attention to detail, discipline, etc. What's normal and human, and then bring in a number of analyses to this to understand why they're going wrong, and then design them out effectively, brainstorming good ideas. And a lot of the other tools we use in Lean are excellent to come in here. So it mentions 5 whys. We would definitely look at using brainstorming. We would definitely look at a PDCA, so the Plan, Do, Check, Act iterative process of assessing whether the countermeasures we've put in place are going to work. But far better than that, I think let's have a look at some typical examples, because I think that will help to highlight what this is or what it looks like. And once your eyes are opened, you'll see a far greater number of examples of this, even in our everyday lives. So let's have a look, for example. So let's take a look at manhole covers, and that's obviously assuming they haven't disappeared, the covers have been stolen or something like that. Let's see now, does anybody understand why it says there that the covers are best round to prevent the cover from falling in? What happens in comparison when we have a square or a rectangular cover on a manhole? What can happen?
Fall in if present.
Absolutely. Think back to our childhoods, or maybe working with the folk at Singakwenza with the early childhood development, fitting shapes into things. If you've got a circle and if the lid is greater than that circle, you can't turn that anyway for it to fall through the hole. But if it's any form of square or rectangular, the diagonal is longer than the sides, and you can turn that thing so it'll fall through. And obviously that would then become quite a big safety hazard on the roads, and difficult to get the cover back into place if it's fallen down into the chamber below. So there's an example. Even though round covers are more expensive to manufacture and so on and so forth, this is why they would be round in these sorts of cases. Often in manufacturing, the lids of tanks are round for that similar reason, so that the lids on a tank can't fall in as well if it comes loose from its hinge, for example. How about our kettles? Looking at this, the cutoff switch. This obviously is an electric kettle. And for me, what's interesting is to compare it to the gas kettle. So at home, we have a gas kettle that has a whistle. And so, of course, when the water's boiling, the whistle goes off and makes this most absolutely ear-splitting shriek of a whistle that gets us all running to come and turn it off. But that's only a level 1 error proofing. It's telling us when, and somebody still needs to act. if we'd walked out without realizing, that thing could carry on, and of course the kettle could run dry. Whereas with these switches on an electric kettle now, it'll turn off the kettle, and even if the kettle is dry or it runs dry, it's a safety mechanism to make sure you're not going to burn the element out. So there's a great example of an error proofing to prevent damage. What about this one? Anybody had the situation where, and typically maybe with kids or something, when we have a water outage, people come and do what with the taps? Turn on the taps. Ah, no water, and walk away, usually with the plug still in the sink, right? So at least having an overflow or drain hole maybe doesn't save us from wasting water, like perhaps if we had some sort of a tap that closed itself automatically when there's no pressure. At least we don't end up with consequential damages by flooding our house, as an example. Then we can look at things like plugs or sockets, wall sockets. You might see it, for example, particularly if you're traveling and there's a shaver plug socket in the bathroom when you're traveling is different from the plug points for other things as well. So that's an example. Of course, you might have seen our spell check. How many of us turn it off though? And as we know, it doesn't find everything. If you write the word form when you meant from, or if when you meant of, it doesn't find it, but obviously it's a help. And of course, if you're closing a file that you've been working on, you might well get prompted to save it. And then the last one here is a good example of medicine bottle caps. Having this particular mechanism where you've got to squeeze and push and twist in order to get that bottle cap off, which helps to prevent young children from potentially accessing that medication. Any of these seem like anything you want to add? We're going to cover a few more examples. Okay. Some ones, and what's wonderful is seeing how so many of these things are almost intuitive. They're just these clever ideas that you think, oh, why didn't I think of that sometimes? So let's take this example, and it happens with anything. I mean, the way my mouse plugs into the side of my laptop, or every time I try to put a flash stick in, how often do you put it in? Oh, wrong way around. Got to turn it, hey? And we think that's just a fraction of a second. But when you add up the number of times you do that over your entire working life, you've wasted hours going, oh, wrong way around. Okay, and imagine if that's in a manufacturing setup where it's now wasted time in getting this right. Having something like this that tells you that's the right way up, one time only, not this. And so this would be an example at least of preventing or making sure that you fit it the right way. So something like that. This next one, for driving a car into a garage, making sure you know where to stop so that you don't hit the end. I've seen also people will say to me what they've done is they've drawn a line or something on the wall of the garage, and they know when their eye is lined up against that, that's a point to stop. So that would be at least one level of error proofing. This tennis ball on a string is the next level. At least it sort of hits you and it touches something on your car, as opposed to if I wasn't quite paying attention because I was, you know, listening to the music or on the phone and I didn't watch the line on the side of the wall. You know, this would be a level 2, the next level of error proofing. And then maybe a further level could be, some people say they bolt or they, you know, drill or nail a piece of wood to the floor in the garage, and as a tire touches that, they now know and they would stop, and that would more or less prevent the car carrying on and potentially hitting the wall. And then some others. Here's an example of somebody saying they always will put elastic band on their wrist to remind them they've turned the oven on, or to remind them to do something. It's like, oh yeah, I better go, and that kind of a thing to remind them. And here's an example of marking the different cables. Many of us with our home offices these days with COVID have ended up with very messy cables, and then the cable goes around the back of the desk or through, and like, which one is it? That's the plug that I need to pull out. Having something like this, top and bottom, would make it so much easier than pulling and seeing which one it is. And then straight away, you know which is the right one to pull out if you need to disconnect something, instead of spending another 5 minutes pulling the cables and potentially getting it wrong. Back of your TV, for example, when you've got all the various devices back there as well. Here's some other examples, stove A versus stove B. In stove A, it's a little difficult to figure out which switch operates which plate. And if it was one of those old ones, you know, we're now fortunate to have gas, but in those old days, you had to wait a while to feel whether the right plate came. Oh, it wasn't that one. I meant it to be this one. I've turned on the big one when I wanted the small one. And often what would happen, it would have those little markers, but they'd get damaged or they'd wear out over time. And now it wasn't obvious which switch was for which plate. In the bottom, you've got a situation with stove B, where of course the switches mimic the layout of the plates, and it's very difficult to get it wrong. However, and you might also have this view, I look at it and go, yes, that's great, but if I have heavy pots, I'm going to bash those switches and potentially damage them. So maybe there would be another way to do it as well. So you can see you've got to think through your error proofing and understand what might happen or what other errors might happen. If the error is, I want to prevent turning on the wrong switch, great. But if the error is, I want to avoid stuff getting damaged, maybe then a different solution is right. And then we've got things like this, making sure we have the right size SIM card to fit. Or this example where if you're a pie shop, and I know we've got Dion from Just Pies here, so I need to be careful in my example. And the pies are being sent from the pie factory to an outlet and perhaps packed out into a warmer. And now maybe it's potentially quite difficult to know which was the chicken pie and which was the beef pie. And we wouldn't want to sell beef to someone who's not eating red meat, etc., etc. How do we make it easy to see? And this could be an example of what we could do in that sort of a situation. Okay. And then this one, which has been the topic of Sarah's blog post, which some of you might have seen leading up to this session, where she shared the very unpleasant experience of having the wrong fuel, petrol, put into her diesel car. And while she was able to express the experience that she was well looked after from a customer experience point of view, in that the garage ensured that the issue was addressed and all of that before she drove away, it obviously was a very undesirable mistake to make. And so having an opportunity to ensure that something like that can't happen is increasingly being designed into vehicles and obviously fuel station operations, such as an example I heard from one where they get the petrol attendant, with the cameras on the forecourt to hold up different color tags or tokens if it's diesel versus if it's petrol, and sort of communicating with the customer to confirm they said diesel, not petrol. And then I'm held up the petrol token, I'm holding the petrol nozzle, and in I go. So it's then easier, it's an extra step in the process, which might help, but often there people have said, I've held up the wrong thing because I was distracted anyway. And then we end up with a better solution being something like different nozzle sizes. The nozzles on petrol are different sizes to the nozzles on diesel, so it's a lot harder to get it wrong. And then even the vehicle I drive nowadays has actually got an error-proof mechanism whereby if you accidentally put a petrol nozzle into the tank's entrance, it triggers something to close, like a lock mechanism that closes before you can even start putting things in. So you can see it's a great example of different levels of error proofing, from a let's check we're using the right fuel and I'm holding up a tag, to different size nozzles that make it like this doesn't look right, through to you can't do it, not possible at all. And you can see that there's an element of thinking through how serious is the consequence and the cost of the error versus what is the potential cost of the error proofing mechanism. There's no point in the cost of the error proofing costing more than the error itself. So getting that balance right is really important. An area where we really need to make sure, because the cost of safety is something that shouldn't really be much of a debate. Here we have a situation, both in a machine situation, but also even a home situation, where we want to make sure we avoid injury. So if you are working with very dangerous machinery, lathes, and those kinds of things, as well as this kind of guillotine paper cutter, you will often find this is the situation where you require having one hand here, one hand there, and then you operate the unit with a foot pedal. And unless all those things are depressed, you know, the machine itself won't operate. And if you get distracted and turn around, the machine will turn off before you can potentially put a hand in there. It's a bit like anybody who goes out deep sea fishing and you've got that dead man switch on ski boats. That kind of a thing, whereby if somebody falls overboard, at least the boat doesn't carry on going around and around, or head off, you know, into the horizon or something like that. So those sorts of elements, are sort of those switches are crucial. And here's an area where, and I think there was that question earlier, what stops people overriding these things? Absolutely. And to me, if you've got a machine like this with those kind of safeties, it really is critical that you have a situation where nobody can override those, depress it, or have two people, one person pressing the button while someone else works on it, and to make sure those steps are in place. And you'll see any kind of machine guarding, where if the guarding is removed, the machine stops, would be examples of error-proofing safety switches, limit switches to prevent injury. And similarly, many of us will have a gate. You know, the gates when you drive in, to try to make sure that we don't end up injured like that. And here's a couple more, perhaps, you know, our park sensors to make sure we don't hit something, don't drive into something, or there's this, as you drive into a you know, underground parking area, some sort of a warning that maybe it's better to hit that than to actually drive in into that. I mean, any of us ever had canoes or bicycles on a roof driving into a garage? We'll definitely want to think about some sort of protection like this again to prevent that happening. So these are all kinds of examples to get you thinking. And many of people are now saying, well, you know, that's great. What about in my transactional, in my service environment? Where are there examples? Well, here's one where, let's say this is a form that requires signatories. But depending on how big the authorization, let's say this is for spend, how much am I allowed to sign? Well, if I'm going to buy just a few pens, I only need my manager to sign, but if I'm buying a new printer, I need the general manager to sign on this purchase requisition. You then can have some sort of a system like this in the form that highlights, depending on what kind of purchase it is, who might need to sign it off, depending on the circumstances. And of course, if you've got that on your form, people can then see who might need to sign these different things. And other examples of transactional things when you automate, I mean, anytime you go and you fill in an online form and it says you haven't submitted your age or your phone number or something, please go back and fill that in before you click submit. That's another example of an error-proofing step in an online form where you've got mandatory stuff that's needed. And if it's put in the wrong format, I mean, think of Excel, where if you enter a date in the wrong format, it tells you through the data validation type tools or other things that this is not right. You either need an integer number or you need to choose from a drop down or something so that the data is entered in the right format to allow further processing. So those would all be examples of more transactional or office-based Poka-Yoke or error proofing to make sure we don't end up going back and forth to check and correct the data all the time. So really, to sort of close out, I think the advantages of getting error proofing right are pretty obvious. If it's hard to do it wrong, you need less training for people to get it right. If there's only one way to plug this thing in and not three, there's only one way to plug it in. And so you don't need to do as much inspection. You don't need to spend as much money on QC and QA and inspectors and all of that. You're helping workers not be worried about getting things wrong and the stress of their repetitive tasks and, oh, gee, did I remember to turn the stove off? You know, those kinds of things. And that helps people focus then more on the value adding stuff. You also free up time. You spend less time on other things, and you'll find then people are less stressed about it. And I love this particular saying here. We often talk about it as we are involved in problem solving so much that while intellectuals or experts in our field solve problems, the real genius comes in preventing them. Often what happens is you get more kudos for solving the problems, whereas if you prevent them, nobody ever knows how clever you were. But actually, which is better? Definitely preventing them. So as a summary, We can use Poka-Yoke or error proofing wherever something can go wrong and where the consequences of it going wrong are potentially serious or are going to have some sort of additional cost implication that we'd like to avoid. And it can be applied in just about anything, anywhere where you want to make sure it's not possible to do it right. We're always going to, we need to acknowledge actually that it's perfectly normal to make mistakes. Even if our people make mistakes, is there something that we might have done the same thing in the same circumstances, particularly if people are distracted, personal situations, busyness, frenetic work? Let's help make it right first time. We want to help people do a good job for all those reasons. So let's make sure. And then we can go faster. If it's easy to do it right, people don't have to stop to check, is it right? No, I know it's right. I can carry on and get on to the next thing. So for all these reasons, Poka-Yoke or error proofing can help us get the job done right and faster with less stress in everything we have to do. So let me pause, maybe come out of sort of slide share mode. And yeah, I'm really keen to hear comments or thoughts from anybody around. Were any of these unusual? Most of them I think are quite obvious, but where do you think we might find opportunities to use them? Ian, Dinesh, Alison, any comments?
Well, I'm hoping you will sort out the tax thing for next year for all of us. That'll be great.
Well, it'll be great because, and it's so true, because this is what happens in our businesses. We do something all the time on our website, for example, or on our contact forms. We know what to fill in where. It's obvious because we designed the damn thing, right? But for somebody who's never come onto our, how about another example? I had to go to a new office place somewhere today, and I didn't quite know where it was. Google Maps got me close. I've driven past before I see the thing on the wall. Now I've got to turn around and come back, instead of somebody going, imagine going to this place the first time, I need to put the sign for the office before, or there needs to be a sign from both sides, depending on which way people are coming. So you can see those kinds of issues being typical examples.
Tanya, it's Dinesh. Just a comment from my side. I've got 2 of my colleagues also sitting in my office as well.
Okay, good.
From my experience is that we often are reactive to the situation instead of being proactive. And, we just get in and we say, okay, it's a new product. Yes, the engineer has designed it, production take over and run with it. And then, whoops, we've got a problem here. And no one sits back, brainstorm and say, okay, how can we foolproof the system, especially in production, going and giving it to the operators, and we're leaving it in their hands. And at night, management is not there, just a supervisor, supervising all the people. And oops, it's gone to the customer, and then we get a customer complaint. So for me, it's an eye-opening in terms of sitting back, thinking about it carefully, brainstorming that, and implementing an error-proof system to assist.
Perfect, absolutely, and it's exactly that kind of thing. We've designed the thing. It's obvious. It's easy. How could they? Oh, they've messed it up because it's not as obvious to them, for example. And what you find in any design, there are a whole lot of tools. I mean, you're probably familiar anyway in manufacturing environment with the sort of risk analysis tools like an FMEA, failure mode and effect analysis, or those sorts of things, which are in some ways very much structured brainstorming that force us to think about things from a range of different areas as well. And so that will help ensure we look at what are all the modes in which this thing could go wrong, assume it's going to go wrong, assume something's going to go wrong, and how can we sort of stress test it. And that analysis is really good. And then to some extent, exactly, I think like you were saying, let's go and try it out. Let's go and pilot, or let's go and get something actually happening as a test to see, let me give it to someone else to do, to see if it's possible to mix it up in case there's something I haven't thought of. And, really, really stress test and, foolproof this kind of thing, because in many ways things go wrong when we've only looked at it with one particular set of eyes.